Ruler School is brought to you by Happy Little Hug Factory and these amazing patrons.
Extra special thank you to guest lecturer patrons Brody Harris and Lance Albertson.
Thank you for your support. Enjoy the video.
Hey guys, what's going on? It's Paul, and I'm bringing you a tournament report today for GP Munich this past weekend. Before we get started, of course, I want to remind you to subscribe to Ruler School's channel for more content like this. And of course, like the video if you like the video, and let us know down in the comments below what you thought of this tournament. Of course, we're going to have a question at the end of the video for you to answer, of course, but it's really great if you guys can comment down below. Love to interact with you guys and talk to you more about this tournament or anything Force of Will related, so make sure you do that. So let's just get right into the ruler breakdown for this event. It doesn't say on here, but there were 101 players in Munich, and there were about 35 of those players playing Scheherazade, 14 Lumias, 11 Keurig, 6 Imel, 5 IU, 4 Tigris, 4 Feyrer, 4 Shayla, and then about 18 other rulers / decks that were being piloted. Alright, and here's the top deck list for this event. Before we get started today, I just want to let you guys know that we're making a shift in terms of the video schedule. So on Mondays, instead of the tournament reports, we're going to start doing the Teachers Lounge podcast live here on YouTube. So definitely check that out. It's going to happen sometime in the evening. I think it's like 8 or 9 o'clock. Jeremy will definitely let you know what that looks like. And then instead of something else happening on Tuesday, we're going to do tournament reports that day, and then feature matches, of course, on Wednesday, deck profiles on Friday and Saturday like normal. But we're just shifting the schedule a little bit to make things work a little bit better just in terms of our schedules. So just keep that in mind. But here we go. We're going to move into the top deck list right now. And the winner of the entire tournament was Lars Grams, who topped with his IU deck list. That's right, Scheherazade did not win GP Munich. So just keep that in mind. So congratulations to Lars for winning, of course. This is a pretty standard IU package. Every IU player has different cards they want to include because it's basically a Epic Stories deck, but in the New Frontiers format. One card I do want to point out here, and it's going to be on the screen, I want you guys to become very aware of Twin Blades. Twin Blades in this list, and in many of the other lists you're going to see today, is a very important card. And that's because it does a lot of work in this tournament specifically, especially in the top cut. And it's a card that we're going to need to be talking about as we go through these top deck lists. So this is the standard list. If you need to pause the video and take a look at it a little bit closer, as always, these deck lists will be down in the description below. So if you need to zoom in on a particular card, or you just need those lists for any of your Force of Will needs, those will be down in the description below, of course. And again, just congratulations to Lars, and we're going to keep moving on. Next up, we have second place Friedlin von Meyerhofer, and guess what? Yeah, Scheherazade didn't even make it into the top 2, so yeah, there's that. Keurig got there, so this sort of just gives credence to the fact that Keurig is still a very powerful deck in New Frontiers. It can make top 8, and it can even almost win. So just keep that in mind. Keurig is still a deck you need to test against. It's something that is very, very powerful. Of course, in the United States, there's not much that we're going to need to worry about Keurig because most of our events are over. If not all of them are over because of GP Denver being done. But this sort of just gives you an idea of how Keurig is looking as we move away from Lapis Cluster. And of course, because we have dual stones, he's able to go into green, which is his most prolific color. He's able to run things like Sylvia, Lorite, Feyre Spell, Severing Winds, which you can hardcast later. He can even run things like Gaze of a Powerless Dragonoid in his sideboard alongside other cancel spells and Destruction of the Portal to get rid of things like Lightning Cave, which might be like in a Time Splitting Witch or IU. If you notice that in the last slide, Lightning Cave is a very good card to use against Keurig. So you need some form of addition hate, as well as any other additions in the game right now that are just really strong, such as Ataraxia, Cydia, Verdant Green, which we're going to be talking about more in just a second. But just want to give you guys a little bit of a sneak peek. This is kind of where Keurig is sitting in terms of its power level and in terms of its design philosophy as we move out of Lapis Cluster. But congratulations again to Fridolin for getting second place, and we're going to keep going. So we have our first Scheherazade list, and they got top 4, which I think is worth noting as well. They got third place, so congratulations to Sasha Ledlika for getting top 4 with this list. And something you're going to notice if you stare at this deck long enough, and I know most of us don't want to because it's just another darn Sherry list, but there's no final battle. There's very few dolls in this list. And in their places, we're seeing things like Flourishing Hope, Viola, and Thought Control. And of course, the card I told you to look for is Twin Blades of Hope and Sorrow. And I'm going to put that card on the screen again because I think it's a card that you are just going to want to keep in mind. It does flip over into another card, which is just basically reanimate something, such as your Blazer, or just get rid of a J Ruler / Resonator. So this list is doing something very, very different. So it does play the one patrolling guard doll, and it does play Eve. So in the situation where you do find yourself flipping into Scheherazade, you do have a power play, but it's only running the last audience outside of those dolls. And I think we just need to kind of talk about the last audience a little bit, because this is one of those cards that people really underestimated, and now it's one of the only dolls that is staying in the Scheherazade list, kind of just proving the power of quick cast dolls and the power of this one doll in particular. These are probably the best dolls in the game, outside of things like Eva. And Djinni, which it's not a doll, but it does use the legend mechanic to a very strong degree. So I would kind of include it into the broader legend archetype for Scheherazade. But these 3 cards are probably the best dolls that we have in the game. And I would even argue that Last Audience is the best doll in the game. And you don't need Puppet Maker to make it good. And you don't need Doll Audience to push through in terms of damage. This deck in particular is so interesting because it's using Blazer much more proactively than other versions of this list. You'll notice that it's also not a blue list or a red list. It's sticking to white, but it's not including Miscalculation in the main board as a way of staving off things like Keurig or other forms of aggro. It's using Twin Blades as a way of managing your opponent's board, buffing your Blazer or your other Resonators. As a way of buffing your last audience and having them lose to it as a result. All of this stuff just works really well together, and I want to talk about this more as we move into the thoughts section, but this just kind of proves that you don't really need dolls so much in order to make Scheherazade a powerful deck to use. You also notice that they're running Tamas instead of a general draw engine that we see in other Scheherazade lists. I think this is because it works really well later in the game, and it allows you to just ping for an extra 200 damage, which is really, really solid. But I think this list is very interesting. I think it's a different take on sort of like an anti-meta Sherry, and it's using white in ways that we haven't really seen before. So I just props off to this list. We're actually going to see a very similar list from Jean-Paul later in this video, but I wanted to spend some time talking about this because I think it's just a different way of taking on Sherry in terms of its anti-meta role in the format, and I think that's really, really different, and so we need to consider this list. But congratulations to Sasha for getting 3rd place, and we're moving on to 4th place now with Nick Brandis, or Brands. I'm not really sure exactly how to pronounce it specifically. I'm going to call him Nick Brands. I hope that's okay, man. But this is a more traditional white Scheherazade list. Of course, it's using Twin Blades again in combination with the Last Audience to give you this really interesting combination of interactions. As well, it runs Final Battle, which is something you probably didn't see in the last list, which I also found very interesting. It uses Last Audience much more as a deck, not a deck, but a board manager, in that you can just swing with it, cast Twin Blades on it, suddenly the card that they blocked with is dead, and then you have a way of reanimating your Blazer or getting rid of their Scheherazade or their J Ruler in general when it flips. And of course, we're running the Intervention of Reality. This is a really good way of also buffing your Resonators. If you have Legend 1, it gives you +6/+6 to a Resonator. If you have Legend 3, you get to destroy an addition. And then if it's Legend 5, you get to search your deck for any Resonator that you need. And something to really keep in mind with this card, and this is recently brought to my attention, if you're not able to destroy an addition, you do not get to search your deck. So that's something you really need to keep in mind. If you're not able to do that, you need to be able to destroy an addition before you can search your deck for a Resonator. Otherwise, this card sort of whiffs. But other than that, this list is a kind of a good go-between between traditional Doll, Scheherazade, mid-range control, and the other Scheherazade list that we're seeing in this this top 8 breakdown. Mostly because it's floating between this play dolls and puppet maker for draw power and additional tempo, and the using twin blades and blazer to manage your opponent's board state with last audience and their hand. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say about this. I think it's interesting that they only have 4 of their cards in their extra deck. I think they just forgot to put something in. And I think that's they just forgot, like a Scarlet's Agony or something. Other than that, congratulations to Nick for getting 4th place. And the last Scheherazade list we're going to be looking at today is just another variation on the Twin Blades Scheherazade White Control. And of course, this is from John Paul Klintworth, who ran the Blue Sherry list at GP Collinsville and won that tournament with that list. So he's familiar with anti-Scheherazade lists. Another thing I didn't mention in these previous lists is that he's running a Thief Sing. Actually, he's running 2 Thief Sings as a way of sort of bringing back Resonators to your hand. Things like Blazer to recast them, and because it's an inheritance, it's not an inheritance to bring it back to your hand, but it does give you options to give your Resonators +6/+6 as well. So it functions in this way of being able to reuse your Eve or your Blazer as also a way of pumping up your Resonators so they can survive final battles, and they can, especially with Last Audience, again, you can just buff the Last Audience and then suddenly you have the ability to destroy a lot of your opponent's board. So Last Audience is sort of functioning as final battle without the paying of the life. You just play the game more proactively and reactively instead of using final battle, reducing your life cost, reducing your life in general, and having a wipe the board. And so I think that's a really interesting philosophy in this deck build, using the Last Audience more as a way of getting rid of your opponent's resources by just buffing it and having it survive. And that just speaks to the power of Last Audience in general. It's a really strong doll, really strong Resonator in general. This card might actually see play outside of Scheherazade if we see more of a green control list coming out of New Valhalla, but I'm not entirely sure, so don't quote me on that, but I would consider at least this card as something to play. But yeah, again, congratulations to John Paul for getting 5th place, and we'll be moving to 6th place now. So 6th place was Nino Zimmerman running his Imel list, and this of course is using Alter, but as well as the Kingdom of Diversity, so that you can have all these low cost Resonators that get huge. And of course, because they're running it in Imel, they will get Flying and Drain, as well as Imperishable, which is completely irrelevant, but they will get Imperishable. So that's relevant as well. So the thing about the Kingdom of Diversity is it gives you +1/+1 to every Resonator you control for each different race among your J Resonators. And of course, that's why you're seeing all of these really weird cards being played. Things things that are normally not really played that often. Like I believe it's the Ferryman here is not normally played. You'll see it on screen just so you get a sense of it, but generally it's just it's a way of playing a Resonator, drawing a bunch of cards, filtering for your Kingdom of Diversity, and that's really what the list is trying to do. It's also a way of dumping your Demonic Dead into the graveyard so that you can bring it back. And then you also have Kage's Moonbeam Butterfly to bring out things like Altar or Kingdom as a way of sort of just creating the board state you need in order to go off. And in the sideboard, they're playing a couple of Mephistopheles. I actually think this card is going to see a lot more play going forward because White has got some serious stuff coming in terms of the support that we're seeing from New Valhalla. So I can only imagine that this card is just going to get stronger and better going forward. So just keep your eye out for this. If you haven't picked up a couple of copies, I would definitely do that now. This card is going to be pretty darn good pretty soon. So other than that, there's most of the things in here are things that people have seen before, with the exception of the Ferryman. But other than that, congratulations to Nino for getting top 8 with this really cool list. And yeah, next up we have 7th place Stefano Zamagni, who got top 8 with their Lumia list, which I think is really cool. I'm actually really sad to see Lumia go. I don't know about some people, but besides just her being one of the coolest characters, coolest arts in the entire Lapis cluster, I really just like her design as a ruler, because she gives you a lot of agency based on the number of enter effects that you have in your deck. And of course, Lumia has shifted into playing something like City of Ataractia, or Ataractia City of Verdant Green, excuse me. Using that in combination with things like Rachel and Blazer to get just a ton of card advantage and mess up your opponent's tempo. I think this is actually a pretty decent list. The ability for you to just flip your Lumia at any moment and just swing for 10, flickering your opponent's stuff in the meantime, and just making way for your Rachels, your Priscia, and your Blazers to just swing in for a bunch of damage is really, really cool. And then of course it has the ability to manage your opponent's resources on board by using 3 Null Darkness, and then there's 3 of the Thought Control to rip the good stuff out of their hand before they get to play it. Outside of that, they're playing 3 of the Lorite's Disciples in the sideboard, of course with 2 copies of Lorite in case they're playing against anything that's really strong in that regard. If they're playing against a wider board, they have a second Priscia that they can slap down and start dealing a bunch of damage to. The elf from I think it was the structure deck that I don't know why it's in here, but they might have a really good reason for that. And I think that's just because you have the ability to swing in, give something +2/+2, and then flicker it or whatever. Not entirely sure why this is in the sideboard. This might just be like a signature card, like Leaf Garb or something like that. But then of course they have the normal green sideboard package that is, pretty common. Rapid growths are a little bit different usually in the main board, but they're solid for what this deck does. And it's a pretty standard Lumia shell. I think this deck's actually pretty great. I haven't played a lot of this list just because I don't know what it is. There's something about this list that I'm like, I don't want to use Rachel as much. I like pulling off Mosasaurus and stuff like that, but that's just me. This list is pretty cool. I like the idea that it gets to reuse Blazer, and that's all I really gotta say. So congratulations to Stefano for getting 7th place. And last but not least, we have Kai Bodersky playing a Red Favor list. And what's really cool about this list is there's some cards that we have not normally seen in Red Favor that are seeing some play. So first of all, I just want to highlight those differences right now. So we haven't seen a lot of Lorite's 7 Disciples in the main board for Favor, but it kind of just makes sense because you have Lorite and you have the ability to use Lorite really well in this list because it's, a really decent anti-meta card to just flash in and do some pretty crazy stuff with. It's an elf, so it works really well with Favor. You can tap things down and recover things, especially with things like Spirit Caller Elf. So it's good to have it in the list, and there's of course a couple copies in the sideboard as well. So it's not like it's that hard to get access to. It's just a decent resonator in general. So it's kind of got a nice home in this list. In addition to that, they're playing 2 of the Allosaurus from the Lost Tome structure deck. And this Allosaurus, when it comes into the field, you get to remove something from the top of your deck in order to play this card. It's not a cost. I don't know what I'm talking about. You play it and you remove the top card of your deck, and then you get to play that card whenever you want. But in addition to that, probably the most important thing is it's taking the place of something like Sprinting Flame Horse, or I'm trying to think of another card that gives swiftness, but generally speaking, it's Sprinting Flame Horse replacement, because it gives your J Ruler swiftness. And in addition to that, they're playing the Elven Guard, which is interesting because it's not typically an elf you see being played, but it does recover an elf that you control when it enters the field. And so what I think is really interesting is this is basically resuscitating Will on a 10/10 body, and it can be brought out with Favor. So if you flip Favor, you grab this card, and you have something like Tia and Cecil on the field, you can just recover all your stones, and suddenly everything is free. So I think that's really interesting that this card is being played. It seems like there is a little bit of a mistake in the deck list because this is the wrong stone. This is the white-green stone, not the red-green stone, which works really well in combination with Fiery Fox. So this stone should be the stone that when you rotate it to the graveyard, you draw a card, as opposed to being able to pump your Resonators for +2/+2. So that's the other thing that's a little bit of a mistake, but that's okay. And then the last card I wanted to talk about today is Shawujing. A lot of the Asian lists that I've reviewed recently have seen this card be present in the main board as a way of not playing turn 2 Maribela, but going turn 2 Shawujing and being able to win the Cancel War that way. But this player opted to play them in the sideboard, and I think that's because of just how they were seeing the meta, it being more Lumia focused maybe, or of course Scheherazade being a deck, but of course Lumia and Keurig being something as well. They're like, maybe this card doesn't work so well in the main board right now. We'll be shifting it to the sideboard in case I do play against the Scheherazade matchup. I can, make their spells cost more, or if I'm playing against another deck that uses, cancel spells a lot more effectively, this card will make it so that my spells are a little bit less expensive, and then I'll be able to beat them in that matchup. So I think that was kind of their thought process behind this card, and I think that's pretty good. There is a lot of aggro that made it into the top 8. And of course, Ayu and Keurig made the top 2, so that probably wasn't a bad decision at all. But this is a cool list. I'm going to be sad to see that this list is not going to be something that we see that much of in New Valhalla's New Frontiers format, but it is kind of cool. I think Red Fair is a classic 2017-2018 deck list that is unfortunately not going to be part of the game anymore, but there's a lot of really cool stuff that got to be used in this list, so yeah. Anyway, congratulations to Kai for getting top 8, and then of course we're going to be moving on to my thoughts of this tournament and of the game so far in just a moment. So at this point in the video, I generally like to think about what the meta is shaping into, or what rulers or cards are really shaping the meta for the betterment of the game, or maybe not the betterment of the game, but they're shaping the game regardless of that. And so I just want to kind of give you some thoughts of what this GP brings to the table in terms of what the meta is shaping into. So first of all, I kind of want to just have a little bit of a discussion about aggro in relation to Scheherazade. So basic card game 101, there are about 3 kinds of decks in any given card game for the most part, maybe some exceptions, but they just maybe look a little bit different, but that's the way that generally decks are characterized in terms of aggro, mid-range, and control. So every deck archetype basically falls along that kind of spectrum. Tempo decks are more of like a mid-range aggro. Mid-range control is closer to something like between mid-range and control. It's all sort of on that spectrum. And as we've seen things like Eva and Djinni and Ruin Story be removed from the meta as a result of the ban list, we've seen Scheherazade skew more toward like a mid-range control deck in general. And it's been really good at doing what it does for the most part, just because of how controlling the deck is, through things like The Last Audience and Puppet Maker refilling your hand, and things like Twin Blades being used, and having access to things like Final Battle make it able to go wide, and just being able to wipe your opponent's board if they were to try and establish any form of tempo. But the natural predator of control decks are aggro decks. Of course, we're losing Lumia here pretty soon, but Keurig and Ayu, and after rotation, I would say Tigris as well, are going to be prime contenders for taking on Scheherazade, especially since a lot of decks are being focused into monocolor decks with the apparent lack of dual stones coming in New Valhalla. Given that we've gotten 6 of the 10 stones in New Dawn Rises spoiled for us, we're not seeing any dual stones whatsoever, and so that's probably a safe bet that we are not getting dual stones this cluster, or if we are getting them, they're going to be much later down the line. So Scheherazade is going to be relegated to using only green sources for the most part, and Keurig, Ayu, and Tigris all flourish in the idea that they get their own, with the exception of Ayu, because she has Possession Stone. You have Keurig and Tigris who are able to really utilize their color very, very well. How do I say this anymore? White is becoming more of an aggressive color, especially with the release of Brunhild, which at the time of this video was spoiled last night. So I just want to keep this in mind. Scheherazade might have a little bit of trouble, especially going forward, with decks that are able to put out consistent aggro. And this is just a lesson to say that Scheherazade is a control deck. It is a deck that, you can beat with things like Keurig and Ayu and Tigris / Lumia / Brunhild, etc. So just keep that in mind. Scheherazade is not undefeatable. These are just the archetypes, or the part of the spectrum that can naturally balance her out, given she's still very, very powerful. So I don't want to just say like, oh, just play aggro and you'll beat her. I do want to just acknowledge that Scheherazade is much stronger than a normal control deck, but going forward we might even see her being completely banned, or we might see a lot of her support gone. So these lists are going to be something you want to pick up. Just want to keep that in mind. Next up, I just want to talk about Scheherazade as a deck going forward just a little bit. And this isn't because I want to harp on how good Scheherazade is. I know a lot of American players are honestly just very sick of talking about her, or just looking at this ruler in general. But I think if we're going to, as a community, formulate a reason or articulate a reason why Scheherazade is so powerful, we need to be able to look at the deck and just sort of put that frustration on the back burner and just sort of objectively view the ruler and her support. And just sort of view her as a ruler and why she is so good. And this is just in response to something that Jeff said on the recent TCG Scrub podcast, that we need to be able to articulate why things are powerful, why they are good, and what needs to change for them to be more in line with what we desire as a player base. And so that's something I want to do today. Because I've talked about Scheherazade ad nauseum in the past, but I think what we're seeing is, and this is something that we can give credence to Frank Klosser about when he was talking on the Teacher's Lounge last week, Scheherazade does not need dolls necessarily to be as powerful as she is. This is something we saw from Sasha and John Paul's list, from this chunk of deck list that we saw from Munich. You don't need to play any of these cards on the left. You can just play these cards on the right, and you can still have a very strong deck list, because the Last Audience is such a powerful card, Patrolling Guard Doll is such a powerful card, Eve is such a powerful card. You can just run those 5 dolls and be fine. You don't have to run Doll Audience and Puppet Maker. You can run Viola and Blazer, and essentially you're doing the same thing. And of course, if you're not running any of these and you're not worrying about your opponent's Puppet Makers, you don't have to run Shade, because if you're running Twin Blade and Sword of Fate and Glint of Insight, these other cards, you're able to just sort of take care of your opponent's Puppet Makers, and do it in a much more controlling style. Granted, that opens you up for more aggressive plays from things like Ayu or Keurig, but in general, Scheherazade isn't confined to her dolls. She's just a very well-rounded ruler with the ability to go into essentially a rune deck without having divinity or without having any real stipulations on that rune deck, like we're gonna have here pretty soon. So this is why I think Scheherazade is so powerful. Even though she has the ability to quick cast in dolls, the most powerful dolls are the ones you're going to want to quick cast in. You don't necessarily need Doll Audience to make the deck work, or multiple Patrolling Guard dolls, or any of this other stuff. You can just play solid, well-rounded cards that are multicolored. And this is why I think if we're ever going to have dual stones in New Valhalla, Scheherazade must go, because with her ability to have more resources, more access to things like Blazer, Twin Blades, and Glint of Insight without any real drawback from her playing, black stones in her deck, she's just going to run train, quite frankly. So This is just my attempt to sit down and just talk about Scheherazade from like this objective standpoint. This is just more ammo to use in the anti-Scheherazade argument, and I think this is something that if Jeff has noticed this, I think we're just going to see an outright ban of Scheherazade, or her power level is going to decrease to such a degree because of rotation and the loss of dual stones in final battle and immediate access to Blazer and Twin Blades and stuff like this. I think she will be either a more contained force as we move into New Valhalla, or she will just be gone in general and not a force to speak of in general. So so thanks for just letting me take the time to say this in this capacity. I think it's just important to highlight what is going on in this specific case of people running Scheherazade, because I think it's important to highlight what is good and what is bad about all of this stuff. Next up, I just wanted to talk about some of the rulers that I think are going to be pretty darn good if they get the right support. So as of the recording of this video, we've seen 6 rulers if you include Brunhild. We've seen 6 rulers up to this point, and I think most of these are going to be relatively good. So Brunhild has just been most recently released, and people are hyped about this ruler. A 12/12 flyer that can just bring something back into the field, and this is probably going to work really well with Valkyries, but the idea that white will always have access to black because of the inverse stone, she has the potential to run things like Blazer when other white lists won't be able to do that. Like Tigris will probably never run Blazer. Adam Sykart might. Control lists are definitely something that white will have access to, which is very interesting to say. That's all I'm going to say. And of course, we have Arthur, who is, a pretty decent blue ruler. I don't know if he's better than Time Spinning Witch, but he's definitely got some good stuff to play with, especially with his rune that's able to just remove a bunch of stuff from your opponent's field by putting them into 2 piles and separating things. Things like Nitrogen Blade and Lancelot. He's got some pretty decent tools, and I hope he gets more. Because we have some pretty strong blue rulers, honestly, in Reiya cluster. And I would like to see him compete with that. Not to mention he's basically a Sith Lord, so we need more Sith Lords in Force of Will. It's awesome. Of course, we have Lucifer as well, who is got this really interesting control aspect to him in that most of his win cons are related to him discarding your opponent's hand and being able to play these really, really solid resonators. So for that reason, I think he's really good. The fact that you get to flip him and your opponent just discards the rest of their hand is also relevant, especially late game when you are pining for resources and trying to get the leg up on your opponent and answering their answers before they get to put them onto the field. I think this ruler is going to be relatively decent. 8/8 is pretty standard, and he has some really good board removal and discard options too. So Lucifer's got some definite potential in the new meta. And then I included Chimimi mostly because I think there's potential with all of the really strong green support that we have going into New Valhalla. She has the potential to be a really strong, like, high-end tempo deck potentially, depending on the support that we see for her going into the next few sets. But the idea that she just flips and gives everything +4/+4 is pretty darn good, and she's a 10/10 body. And of course we have ways of protecting her through things like Winds of Salvation, Lorite, and Feyre's Spell, and Elemental Blast, and all these like really good supportive spells in green. So I think she has potential to be really, really strong, and her rune that can, summon 3 elephant tokens is pretty decent, granted that you're not going up against black. So I think these rulers definitely have some potential. I'm not really convinced of Fu Shi quite yet, so he's not necessarily in this list. But I'm interested to see what the rest of the rulers are, and I think these might actually, with the right support, be the best rulers going forward. And then I just kind of want to talk about the meta as it's shaping up currently. I'm always looking ahead. I'm always looking ahead at, what cards are going to be really strong and really something I want to be using. And as it's shaping up, this is generally the meta, and I've included Imol because we actually have a mana dork for white, which is completely new. The fact that Tigris gets to use that, Adam, and Brunhild get to use that, and then Imol, of course, gets to use that as well. I think that's just really interesting. The fact that you can just ramp into your relatively cheap to play J-Ruler is pretty great. So I think Imol might have more support now than she has in the past. The fact that she has a dork that she can use in color is also like a huge boon to her. Being able to cast things in on your opponent's turn, and then Adam being able to like jump ahead a turn in terms of mana to play some of his bigger angels is also really solid. So I think this is the way the meta, for at least, you know, for Reiya cluster heading into New Valhalla, these are the rulers you're going to be wanting to look at if you want to craft anything around these rulers. And then these are the rulers that we don't necessarily know anything about quite yet in terms of how playable they are going to be. But generic white support, generic blue support, black has some pretty good internalized support for Lucifer himself, and then Shamimi has just the benefit of being in green and being relatively strong on her own. So these rulers are going to be the unknown variables going in, and these rulers are going to be the proven, pretty strong rulers going forward. So this is the way I kind of see the game shifting into certain rulers' favor. And these are the decks you should be testing against. Scheherazade may or may not leave. I don't know. I'm not quite sure yet. It seems to me, just from the way I've heard Jeff talking about her, she's probably going to go. So you might even just like cross her off this list. But if that's the case, it's going to be between Time Splitting Witch, Gil, and maybe like an aggro list and Imol. So yeah, that's all I got to say about that. But of course, I'd like to end the video with asking you a couple of questions. What Reiya cluster deck are you going to be testing, or are you testing currently? And which one do you want to see being tested going into New Valhalla? I'm definitely interested in Gil, probably because he's the best deck, and he's also probably the deck that is the hardest to use. And then, of course, Pandas. I just think Pandas have never been good in New Frontiers, unfortunately, but they might be fairly decent going forward, especially with all of this really bonkers light support that just is so good. So those are probably the two that I'm most interested in testing going forward. But what about you? Let us know down in the comments down below. Of course, if you like this video, hit like and hit subscribe as well, because we're going to be doing more of these videos in the future, of course. And there's always deck profiles and feature matches that you can watch as well. And then, of course, tune in next week on Monday for the Teacher's Lounge, where Jeremy Franklin, Ryan Miles, Frank Klosser, and Brandan Bremont are going to be talking about even more spoilers from this week's set of stuff. So, like I said, it's been good talking to you guys. I will talk to you pretty soon. I believe Bologna is this weekend, so I will be talking to you on Tuesday of next week about that GP. But until then, this has been Paul, and I'll catch you later.